Welcome to this week's 168. You can subscribe to these videos on YouTube or you can follow us on Twitter.
So one of my favorite stories is about an 8-year-old girl who comes to her dad and says, "Hey Dad, what is sex?" And the dad immediately, his heart drops. He's like, "Oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting to have this conversation so early with my daughter." But he figures since she asked, I might as well tell her, and so he kind of leads her through this explanation that's age appropriate and that can help her understand what sex is. And at the end of the whole conversation, he says, "Sweetie, what made you ask this question? Why do you want to know about sex now?" And she said, "Well, I saw this form on the table and it said sex, M or F." As now the dad's even more embarrassed because all the daughter wanted to know was how to fill out a form, and yet he has given her this long explanation of what sex is and maybe explained things to her that she wasn't really wanting to know at this point anyway. But I think what this story can teach us is that context matters. That when we understand the context in a little bit more detail, it can help us understand the story more fully. And that's really true for Scripture as we're reading stories. There's a story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus' disciples come to him. And I have this sense that they're coming to him thinking that Jesus is going to commend them and give them a high five. But they come to him and say, "Hey, Jesus, we saw this guy who was driving out demons in your name, and so we stopped him because we don't know who he is. He wasn't one of us, so we stopped him." And again, I think they're waiting for Jesus to kind of pat him on the backs and say, "Good job." But actually what Jesus says is just the opposite. He said, why would you stop him? If he's doing it in my name, why would you stop him? And he goes on to say, if anybody gives someone a cup of water because they're thirsty in my name, the person that was thirsty is not thirsty anymore. So why would you stop him? And this is the part where context really becomes more necessary for us as we're understanding the story. Because then Jesus goes into this explanation. And he starts off by saying, if any of you make the little ones stumble. But what's interesting here is the word for stumble isn't just like, someone that happens to trip or fall. It's this Greek word scandalizo, which really is more serious. It's not just, someone happens to stumble or fall, but this intentionality and this pushing and causing to move away, and there's this separation that's in this word. And I think as we see Jesus say this, we learn something about the heart of Christ. Because Jesus goes on to talk about, if any of you make the little ones stumble, if any of you force them and push them away, it would be better if there was a millstone tied around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. And then he says all of these gory things like if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off, or if your eye causes someone to sin, gouge it out. And we read this, and without the right context, we could think, man, this is pretty dark, Jesus. This is kind of nuts, and I don't know that I want to be a part of this. But one thing that was pretty relevant in those cultures was they would use the imagery of a body to talk about a group of people. Some of you might be familiar with the passage in Corinthians that talks about one body, many parts. Where we talk about the hand and the head and the feet and the eyes. And that idea, that imagery of a body used to talk about a group of people, or body parts to talk about a community of people, was pretty common in those days. And so in Corinthians, what was so crazy or maybe subversive about that text was not that they were using a body to talk about the group of believers, but they were saying that the foot had the same importance as the head, or that the hands had the same weight as the eyes. And so Jesus, though, he draws from that same imagery, that same metaphor here in this story. He's not literally saying if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, or your eyes, gouge them out. But what Jesus is saying is if what you're doing is excluding people, is pushing them away, is causing them to not be a part of this, well, it would almost be better if you weren't a part of this community. And I don't think Jesus really is trying to tell these disciples that you don't belong here anymore, but he's emphasizing how important it is to Jesus that we include people and that we don't do things to intentionally exclude people. I mean, when the disciples had come to him and said, "Hey, we told this guy to stop," they're in essence saying, we drew this line in the sand, Jesus, and we said, we're over here and you're over here. And because you're on that side of the line, You can't do these things. Or we're going to draw a circle around us, and you're either in or you're out. And I think what Jesus is trying to stress here is, you know what? Don't ever do anything that excludes people. But specifically, if you're going to do things in my name, don't exclude people. In fact, it's almost as if you can hear Jesus saying, the kingdom that I am building does the very opposite. The people who have always been on the outside are invited in. And so I think for us, as we're reflecting and thinking about this through the week, the questions we need to begin to ask are, if we claim to follow Christ, if we claim to follow the kingship of Jesus, then it's important for our lives, not just important, it's imperative for our lives to reflect the life of Christ. That if Jesus' priorities are about inclusion and inviting people in and not doing things that exclude people, if those are Jesus' priorities, then those should be our priorities. And so I think as we're wrestling with this today, we need to think, what are some of the areas in my life? What are some of the relationships or the things that I tend to try to keep people away, where I push people out, where I exclude people? And what are ways and opportunities I have to invite people in, to find ways to be inclusive? Because this inclusiveness we see as a theme all throughout the life of Christ. We see it all throughout the story of God, that those on the outside are brought in. And that the work that Jesus does will tear down any wall, will remove any obstacle, any barrier in the way from keeping people out. So how can we do that this week?